So you've probably heard of GitHub Actions. So what is it? GitHub Actions allow you to define pipeline style templates for workloads such as jobs, builds, and other various tasks, all in your GitHub repository. You start with a YAML file, you define a trigger which can be a pull request, a code commit, a time-based schedule, or more. Once your trigger kicks off, you can do many things like compile code, package code, run Docker containers, run arbitrary code, run a testing cycle, a build, or a deployment. The possibilities are endless. The prices are great. As of the time of this video, it's free for public repositories. You get some free minutes for private repos, and you start paying per minute depending on your tier. My code for my website is on GitHub. My builds and deployments are there too. So in a nutshell, the service that run your GitHub Actions are hosted and maintained by GitHub. Your build and code are all with GitHub. You don't have to transfer code across the internet, and you don't have to build and maintain your own servers. This is great, but there are a few reasons why you would want to host your own. So many companies have a yearly commitment with cloud providers where they spend a bunch of money up front and they have to use that compute over a year. Other companies also have on-prem data centers where they buy a bunch of hardware that becomes underutilized. So you might find yourself in a position where you have a lot of spare capacity and you might as well use that capacity to run jobs and batch workloads. There might also be a use case for security compliance if you want to run some workloads in an isolated compute where you can audit it under your control. So in today's video, I'm going to show you how to run and host your own GitHub Actions platform. Now I have to give a shout out to Sunder. He wrote a blog on how to get started with GitHub Actions on a Kubernetes cluster. He has a Docker file as well as a Kubernetes deployment manifest. So I had to make quite a lot of changes to the Docker file and the manifest. So I put a link down below to his blog as well as a link down below to my Docker file with the changes that I needed to make. Alright, so if we take a look at the Docker development YouTube series GitHub repo, I have a .github folder and a workflows folder in that. That's where we define our GitHub actions. If I go in here, I have a basic GitHub action that runs on Ubuntu latest. It does a Docker login step, does a bunch of Docker build commands, and then pushes the Docker images to a GitHub repo. So very basic kind of Docker workflow that we're running here. And what you should notice is that it runs on Ubuntu latest. This is GitHub servers where we run our action on. So if we come over to the Actions tab, we can see that a bunch of builds have been executed. We can go to Docker series build. We can click on the latest build that has executed. Click on that and we can see all the steps that have run. Now these by default will run on GitHub Actions server and their infrastructure. Now before we start, in order to run a GitHub Actions server, we need to be able to register with our server from our Git repo. So in order to do that, we need to set up a personal access token. So I'm going to go over to my account and then click on settings. Then what you want to do is head over to developer settings, then click on personal access tokens, and then generate a new token. And then what we can do is we can give a name for this token. So I'm just going to call it self-hosted action, so we know what this token is for, and I'm going to give it access to the repo scope. Then we go ahead and say generate token, and we grab the key, the one-time key that we'll never see again. So once we have a personal access token, we're going to run the commands to create a registration token. And basically it's this guy here. This is used to register a token and hook up the repository with our GitHub Action runner. Okay, so if we take a look at the Docker development YouTube series, I have a GitHub folder, action folder under that, and the self-hosted runner source code here. So we start with a Docker file, and in the Docker file we describe we want Debian Buster. We pass in a bunch of environment variables, including the personal access token that we just created. Then we install a bunch of dependencies. Now I'll go through them very quickly. We use curl to download the runner. We use sudo because we're going to interact with a bunch of permissions. We have a bunch of other stuff to interact with the files and unzip them. And then we also have the dependencies to install Docker. Now we're going to install Docker inside of this runner because we want to be doing Docker run, Docker build, and Docker login commands. So in order to do that, we need the Docker CLI. So the first thing we're going to do is add a user GitHub and add the groups, and then also install Docker over here. We also then give Docker user the ability to be added to the group. And then what we do is we install the runner. So this is the GitHub Action runner installation process. And then we will take a look at this in a sec, but we pass in our entry point. So if you take a look at the GitHub Action runner source code, you'll see there's quite a bit of documentation on how to get started. The prerequisites for Linux is defined here, and if we scroll down we can see there's a config.sh and there's a script to install dependencies and stuff. So this is all in our entry point. So if we take a look at our Docker file, we do the install dependencies over here, and then if we go to our entry point, this is where we register with GitHub. So we register our runner. So as soon as our runner starts, it'll go and ping GitHub Actions and register itself with the repository using our personal access token. So it goes ahead and does that. It then gets the payload and grabs a token from GitHub. It runs the config.sh script, and then it has a bunch of things here to trap and remove based on specific exit codes. So it will, if the container exits, it'll go and deregister and remove itself from GitHub, and then it'll just remain running in a running state. So then what I do to build that is I go into that folder and I say docker build, and I'm just going to tag it as runner. That'll go ahead and build our runner in a Docker container. So now we have a Docker container we can run that'll automatically register itself with GitHub, and that becomes our runner server. So that's how we build our container image. Now I had a bit of a trouble getting this running on Docker for Windows because it's a bit troublesome setting up the right permissions if you're running Docker login and Docker commands inside of a Docker container. So make sure when you're running this, run it on a Linux machine, and most of the build environments should be Linux anyway. So what I'm going to do is say docker run it, and I'm going to mount the Docker sock so we can run those Docker commands, and then I'm going to pass in the GitHub owner for the repo. These are the environment variables that we've defined in the files, in the Docker file, and then I have the GitHub repository name, and then my personal access token for that repository, and then my name of the image. Okay, so you can see it's gone ahead and authenticated, connected to GitHub. Our runner has registered itself, and now it's connected to GitHub and it's listening for jobs to execute. So look what happens when we go over to GitHub and we go over to settings and actions. We see the self-hosted runners. Now if I go ahead and refresh this page, we'll see that a new runner has registered itself. Now you can have total freedom about the names you choose here. I just chose the host name of the container, and then we have self-hosted Linux. These are labels that we've defined. So the way we can trigger this job is if we go to our Docker development YouTube series, GitHub repo, and we just switch to a branch. And you'll see if I go into one of my workflows, I have this GitHub action defined. So let's go ahead and edit that. And one thing you should notice, if you want to run it on this new GitHub action, you have to use the labels that you're targeting. So you can see here I'm running on self-hosted. So that's the label that I've defined. Now let me just change this by just adding a comment called test. And what we'll do is we'll go and say start commit. I'll just say test, and we'll commit it to that branch. So that will go ahead and trigger a new build on our GitHub Actions. So if I click on Actions, we can now see testers running. If we take a look at the bottom here, we see that a build has now been kicked off. So our GitHub Action has picked up the change through GitHub. It's fired a webhook to our runner. Our runner is now starting to do the job. And if we take a look at test, we can click into that, click into build, and we can see the job is now running. So it's setting up the job, and then we'll see we'll do Docker login, Docker build, and Docker push, all from our own GitHub Action runner. So there you go. Look how quick and easy that is. Docker login, Docker build, it's pushing my container. So you can run GitHub Action pipelines on your own infrastructure. And once the job has been complete, you can see that's all green and good to go. You can see it also reports here that our job has been completed. If I go and break out of that, you'll see the runner will automatically start removing itself. So if we head back to GitHub, back to our self-hosted runner, we can refresh this a couple of times, and we'll see eventually GitHub will remove the runner automatically. So if we refresh that, the self-hosted runner is now gone. Now for Kubernetes, the same thing can be done to automate the process. So what we have here is in the GitHub Actions self-hosted runner folder, I have a Kubernetes YAML, and I have a deployment spec for running that same Docker image. So what I can do in Kubernetes is I can say kubectl create ns, create a namespace, and then in that namespace we can go ahead and apply this this YAML file. Now, as part of that YAML file, I've also created a secret with the GitHub personal access token. So you need to set up a secret for that. And then when we do kubectl get pods, we can see we have a GitHub action runner up and running. And if we head over to the Docker development guide, we have a look at the self-hosted runners, we refresh that, and the runner automatically registers itself. So Kubernetes does give us a bunch of things in terms of scalability. So we can say kubectl get deploy, and we can then say kubectl scale deploy, and we can scale our GitHub runner, and we can run multiple replicas. So I can say maybe I want 3. And then if I do kubectl get pods, we can see we have 3 containers now up and running. So if we refresh this guy over here, we can see that there are more of them coming and automatically registering. So there's some advantages to using Kubernetes. I just thought I'd show you, as it is quite interesting. So thanks guys for watching another interesting GitHub Actions video. Let me know down in the comments what sort of stuff you use GitHub Actions for and what you'd like me to cover in the future. And remember to hit that like button, subscribe, and until next time, peace.